On the courtyard of the Karnak temple, the sun burned so fiercely the air shimmered above the stone slabs. A girl named Nefertari stood motionless while priests drew a bronze razor over her head until the last strand fell to the ground and disappeared in dust. She was 9 years old and couldn't understand why the world suddenly felt so cold and foreign in the height of summer. Her father had brought her here 3 days earlier, gently telling her it was an honor, that she would live close to the gods and enjoy a protection ordinary people never knew. He said it with a trembling voice as if he didn't believe himself. Yet he still signed the tablet the temple scribe presented, because the debt in grain and silver wouldn't vanish on its own. When the first tear slid down her cheek, the senior priestess pushed the girl's hand away and hissed that a servant of the god does not cry, that from this moment there are no tears and no old name, because she now belongs to Amun, and Amun does not abide weakness. The words sounded like a sentence, though spoken softly, almost like instruction. That was the beginning of a life that would stretch for more than 43 years. A life behind walls painted with divine glory, but woven inside from silence, orders, and labor, none of it the sort a child could take pride in. Nefertari had no idea she wasn't an exception, that this wasn't a peculiar case, but a rule consuming thousands of girls and women across the land, that the lovely titles sounded like blessings, yet hid a mechanism that could destroy as efficiently as any war. They were called wives of the god, handmaids, the goddess's hands, pure adorers, names soft and exalted like a prayer, but what they carried in practice was hard, austere, and merciless. The outside world saw processions, white linen, and the shimmer of sistrum music, not the things that happened in the cloister's silence. To grasp it, you have to know that purity in the temple meant a ritual state, not a fairy tale about innocence. Purity required control, and control reached further than hair or garments. It reached into the body, movements, voice, gaze, and thoughts, because someone else held the right to decide when a girl could lift her eyes and when she had to keep silent. Most did not choose this path. Some were vowed to win heaven's favor. Others were given up for a debt a farmer couldn't repay after a poor harvest. Still others were brought from afar as war tribute when caravans returned from Nubia or the Levant. All arrived in places they didn't know, where the word home would mean something different from then on. Sometimes these children were only a few years old. The records aren't always precise, but the priestesses' accounts and the traces on papyrus repeat the same picture. Small hands, wide eyes, a long road to the city, and a silence taught faster than song. The younger they were, the easier it was to shape them to the temples. Order. Mutmua, a girl from Nubia, arrived at the age of 8. Soldiers appeared in her village after a victory, collected tribute, took a dozen or so children, tied them by ropes, and marched them north. Mutmua cried the first day, the second, and the third, until a guard told her to learn how to cry without a sound, because tears disturbed the order and could draw the god's anger. After reaching Thebes, she was assigned to the temple of the goddess Mut. The irony of that fate would become clear later, when she understood the language and the names. For she served the patroness of mothers, while she herself was stripped of any right to the ordinary life of a woman she might have become. She wasn't allowed to think this aloud, but thoughts can whisper on their own. The first step in this new world was the water rite. The girl was led into a stone basin and washed with natron, told this is how the dust of the old life is removed. In practice, it was also a moment of thorough inspection to which no one asked her consent, because consent was replaced by authority. They taught that defiance was sin, and sin endangered everyone. Nefertari shivered in the cold water and tried to cover herself with her hands, and then she was told to lower her arms by her sides. Bruises remained on her skin, but nobody called it violence, just a test, because words can change the shape of things and cover them so they shine like holiness. After water came the blade, the head was left smooth as sun-warmed stone, and the mirror showed a stranger. Young girls often wore elaborate braids that held a bit of pride and play, and in a single turn of the wrist, it all vanished. What was private turned into uniformity, easy to recognize and easy to direct. The name vanished too. The old name belonged to family, to the past, to games before the house, and in the temple one received a new one, tied to a deity or to a function. Nefertari was called Neferet Nebet. Beautiful words, soft and proud, yet they demanded she forget the sound her mother used to call her. They said the old name had died, and with it the girl who stood before the gate. This is how a symbolic death looked, followed by a symbolic marriage. In some temples they spoke of a divine union and dressed the girl in thin linen, set a wig and jewelry, led her into the sanctuary where the lamplight danced on stone. The priest spoke formulas in the name of the god, and she repeated vows whose meaning she did not yet fully understand. Mutmua stood straight then, 10 years old, and finally grasped that words about eternal service weren't a metaphor, that from now on she could never wed a mortal, would not inherit, would not decide her own fate, and would remain forever part of a place called the House of the Gods, even if it was not a human home. These ceremonies sounded like a festival, but carried legal and social consequences. They bound a life forever to an institution with its own laws and its own punishments. They closed the road to an ordinary family and ordinary days. No parchment or seal was needed, because everyone knew what a vow before the statue meant. After that came learning and silence. The girls woke before dawn, washed with natron, put on simple garments, and dispersed to the workshops and gardens. Linen had to be woven patiently, grain ground in an even rhythm, offerings prepared with care, and music practiced until sound stopped trembling in the hands. The day was like a braid in which every strand had its place. There wasn't much room for speech. The voice was for hymns and for answering a superior. In silence the heart thumps louder, and thoughts too, which is why some overseers punished a whisper before it finished forming. Takajat, Nefertari's peer from the Delta, sometimes dared to murmur a memory of her mother or the taste of a summer fruit, until one day a hand with a rod came from behind and ended the dream with a single blow. For days Takajat didn't speak at all. Her eyes were empty, and the loom clacked evenly, as if her fingers worked by themselves. A few weeks later, she vanished from the dormitory, and the priestess only said she had been returned to the gods. No explanation, no farewell. The rest understood what that silence meant and didn't ask, because questions can cost more than answers. Eyes watched everything: senior priestesses and priests, guards, rules written and unwritten. The girls' movements were confined to a few courtyards and halls. They could not leave the walls without permission and escort. They could not receive visitors, and any contact with family, if it happened at all, took place under the gaze of those who counted how many words were spoken. Control was part of daily life, like bread and water. There were also purity inspections. Called by a temple name, they sounded proper, but their meaning was felt in the body. As Mutmua grew, she understood that the older she became, the more invasive the procedure was. She was told to undress and stand still while slowly spoken formulas tried to blanket the shame but could not erase it. Sometimes at the end she was given a piece of honey cake, as if sweetness could close the matter. On the day Nefertari first returned after a sleepless night, she realized that, in this world, true boundaries weren't chalked on stone but drawn in the mind, that you could stand in the middle of the grandest temple and feel smaller than a grain of sand. And still she rose each morning, like the others, and did her duties, because the punishments waiting otherwise were better left unnamed. Families gave up daughters for many reasons. They hoped for blessing, good harvests, health, peace after death. Sometimes there was simply no alternative when debt swelled faster than the granary. People outside saw processions and songs, so it was easy to believe the inside was equally exalted. And if rumors arose, the temple's authority could still them with a single word: Escape was almost unthinkable. The walls were high, the guards sharp-eyed, and the world beyond the gate had no place for girls like them. Without money, without family, without the right to a name, they would quickly become the sort of person no one wants to meet after dark. And if someone was caught, the lash and the dark cell taught others not to try again. Morning began before dawn, when the night still clung to the walls, yet the corridors were already stirring. The girls rose without a word, rinsed their hands and faces in cool natron water, put on simple linen dresses, and tied them neatly, because a crooked knot could bring trouble down on one's head. The shared dormitories knew no privacy. Thin mats lay in straight rows. There were almost no personal belongings, and memories of old toys faded faster than footprints in the courtyard dust. Above everything hovered the rule of silence, meant to order the inner life the way regulations ordered the work. After a brief prayer made with movement, not voice, they dispersed to their tasks. The weaving halls clattered with looms, the gardens whispered with leaves, and the kitchens smelled of boiled grain and beer for offerings. It wasn't a spectacle so much as a necessity, because a temple lived not only by song but by hands that produced cloth, bread, and oil. The singers had different work, but just as exhausting. They memorized hymns until the words fell into place on their own and practiced the turn of the arms when they lifted a sistrum or a hand drum. Music was meant to soothe, to lift, to serve, which is why every false note was like a badly set stone in a wall, immediately visible. Speaking wasn't entirely forbidden, only mostly unnecessary. You answered a superior briefly, passed along an instruction, sang what needed singing. The rest stayed in your thoughts, which learned over time to walk quietly so as not to draw the attention of those who kept order. Takajat, who sat beside Nefertari at the looms, had a habit of whispering the shortest sentences when the overseer went to the other room. She asked about the taste of a childhood fruit, or how the river sounds after rain, until one day a rod struck the back of her head and blood ran down her neck. They led her away without a word, and when she returned a few days later, she no longer spoke at all. Soon she disappeared, and the explanation was as short as it was cold, given back to the gods. No one added what that meant, but all understood there are doors that close only once. Fear taught the weaving hall a perfect rhythm in which there was no longer any space for a whisper. A watching system guarded their lives and peered into every corner. Gates had guards, passages were observed by senior priestesses, and attendance lists ensured no one slipped unnoticed from courtyard to storeroom or storeroom to gardens. A path beyond the walls required permission and escort, which were almost never granted. Sometimes the day of a purity inspection arrived. They called it order, yet what lingered in memory was shame. Mutmua learned to stand still and not answer questions that were never asked, to listen to formulas that explained everything, and to breathe so shallowly it would not betray how unwell she felt. After such an inspection, they sometimes handed out a small treat, a scrap of honey cake. It was meant to taste like a reward, but often it landed in the pool, as if the water could carry away another's touch along with the crumbs. Those were small gestures that helped you endure, though they changed nothing. There were nights when Nefertari returned to the dormitory with eyes as wide as the dark. A summons to the high priest's private chambers sounded like an honor, and over time, like a sentence. They explained that the divine voice speaks through human lips, that bodies are instruments of communion, and she understood that language can drape violence in a ritual cloak. From then on, she knew she would keep silent not only by command, but from powerlessness. Rebellion had a price she could not pay, because the rebellious lost everything, even their names. She learned to walk so her shadow wasn't longer than necessary, and to fold her hands so they did not shake too much. When one of them became pregnant, the walls could fall more silent than ever. Sometimes people spoke of a miracle, sometimes a stain, but most often the child was taken at once, and the mother sent to the lowest work as if grime could scrub away memory. Iset cleaned the latrines, though she had once sung in the goddess's choir. She died a few years later, and her grave bore no name. Families outside knew little, and if they knew, they preferred not to ask. At festivals, they saw white garments and heard the songs, and believed such service brought blessing. Debts shrank, fields yielded better, so people told themselves. Questions about the temple's interior were treated like touching fire. The system endured because it braided fear, faith, and custom into one. Every piece had its justification, difficult to prize away. Even escape looked like a road into nothing, without money, without a name, without a home. No one would last long, and if someone was caught, the lash and the dark taught the rest humility faster than words. Once Henutawi slipped through the service gate on a festival night when torches scattered the black shadows. She ran toward the river, hid for 2 days in empty houses, and hungry, stole fruit from a stall until a guard recognized her. She returned bound, flogged, and locked in a cell, and when she came out, she was so quiet, no letter would form on her lips. Nefertari understood the mechanism more clearly. First, it takes your name, then your hair, then your voice, and at last, your hope. And yet each morning she rose and braided her movements so as not to cross any invisible line. At the loom, she struck evenly. In the garden, she gathered leaves with care. In the choir, she breathed where the others did, because harmony was safer than dissonance. Time passed, but it didn't heal. It only threaded days into identical beads, while the memory of home faded like paint in the sun. Sometimes her mother came back in dreams and spoke the old name that could no longer be used. Then she woke and listened for footsteps in the corridor, because even sleep granted no immunity. They were seen most often during processional feasts. They walked in order, carried offerings, sang, and people bowed and whispered about divine favor. Those few moments were like the other side of a mirror where only beauty was counted, not cost. Then the doors closed and everything returned to its place, as if nothing had happened. In such a world, coming of age meant more than changes of height and face. It meant heavier duties, longer trials, and a silence growing denser. Mutmua and Nefertari looked at each other less and less, because the eyes can be taught humility too. When one trembled, the other tightened her fingers on the shuttle, so the tremor got lost in motion. At daybreak, the air was cool, but the corridors held a weight. Even the river wind couldn't lift. It was the weight of words never spoken aloud, yet understood the same by everyone. When the high priest summoned a girl to his chambers, no one pretended it was only for prayer. They spoke of sacred duty, of communion with the divine, of a rite that would bless the whole community. But Nefertari felt it was really violence being wrapped in a soft cloth of words. That evening she was told to go at once. The lamps burned evenly, incense hung in the air. The senior priestess closed the door, and there was a silence in which every small movement sounded like a footstep. The man on the dark wooden chair told her the gods were pleased, and the time had come to fulfill the highest obligation. Nefertari froze. All her life she'd been taught that defiance was blasphemy, and lowering her gaze, arrogance before the heavens. Yet the body knew its own truth and trembled. When she hesitated even for a heartbeat, she heard the warning. Refusal would bring punishment, not only on her, but on those she had once loved. Then everything happened quickly, as if someone had poured water over a wax tablet and let the letters run off without a trace. She returned to the dormitory at dawn, lay down on her mat, and stared at the dark ceiling, counting breaths until the signal for morning work. She didn't cry, because tears had long been a luxury she wasn't allowed. From then on, the summonses repeated regularly. Each sounded the same and demanded the same stance. Stand straight, ask no questions, listen to the formulas that turned suffering into duty. Nefertari learned to separate mind from body, to endure, then gather herself back together when she returned to the loom. Sometimes a girl began to carry new life. The walls then became an echo in which every word, bounced off a different meaning. Outside, people spoke of a sign, a miracle, a God's favor. Inside, decisions were made. The child was taken quickly, the mother removed from the choir or the weaving hall, and sent to tasks meant to stick a patch of guilt on her. Iset had sung clearly and bright, until one day she fell silent. When her belly showed, they led her to side rooms, and she never came back. She gave birth in silence, lost the child in silence, and was handed the tools for cleaning the places others never look. A few years later, she was gone, and her grave remained without a name. Stories like these made dormitories whisper even in sleep. The girls stopped looking into each other's eyes longer than necessary, because eyes show questions. And questions were the most dangerous thing of all, with nowhere to go, ricocheting against everything they were ordered to believe. Even so, there were moments of courage. Someone tried to slip out when a festival scattered the guards' attention. Someone else hid on a storeroom roof, hoping to slip through a side gate at night. It usually ended the same way. An escorted return, a public punishment, the darkness of a cell from which a person emerged even quieter than before. Henutawi, who chose to run for the river, lasted 2 days. A guard recognized her, she returned bound, and her back told a wordless story for a long time. After that, she worked as if she had lost her own shadow and never again reached for the handle of a closed door. Outside, life went on as usual. Festivals had their music, processions their colors. People bowed, priests made offerings. They said the world's order held because temples kept its balance, and thanks to that, the harvests did not fail and the river flooded at the proper time. No one asked the price paid in the cloister's silence. Years passed and the mechanism turned like a wheel. Temple power was strong because it supplied meaning and fear in one. Families gave their daughters hoping for the gods' protection, and the temples took them because that's how the system worked. It needed hands, voices, and bodies to uphold the vision of the world people accepted as the only possible one. The decline didn't come suddenly. It pressed in slowly with changes seeping from the borders. New powers came and went. Lineages lost influence. Cities learned other habits. At last, voices appeared that could name what formulas had wrapped, and though the walls weren't torn down in a single day, the cracks became visible. Nefertari lived to a time when her hair had long since grown back, though she covered it with a wig as tradition required. Her hands were worn, but her movements still even, because the body remembers rhythm better than the mind. She knew how many old words remained in her, how many new ones fear had taught, and that some prayers are spoken only to survive. She was no longer a child. She had lived through more than anyone could tally on papyrus, and she understood that stories about gods are like mirrors. They show what we want to see. Yet between the mirror and the face, there is always a thin layer of air, and that is where the truth lives, the kind that cannot be polished. One day she sat in a column shade, watching younger girls walk toward the basin, and recognized in their steps the same tightness she once carried. She wanted to shout, but shouting didn't belong in that place. So she stood, straightened one girl's garment, and murmured to breathe more slowly. Balance is easier to keep that way. It wasn't great wisdom, more like a small stone at the river's edge that lets you set your foot. Sometimes survival fits into such small things. Grand words don't always save you, while little gestures can be a bridge over the deepest crack. At dusk, the temple became beautiful again. Lamps drew golden furrows across the stone. Music bracketed the hush of footsteps, and the procession moved with a dignity that can't be faked. Tourists from future centuries will marvel at it, unaware of what happened behind doors that do not open for everyone. This story doesn't ask for pity. It asks for attention, for remembering that language can work wonders and commit crimes, that institutions can carry good and violence at once, and that beauty doesn't exempt us from asking about the cost. Nefertari and the others, whose names were taken, teach that silence can be wise, but it can also be a tool, and we should always know who is wielding it.